So what would be a good next step? Well, I would say a good next step would be to ensure that the buttons here and the text input, which we can't really see, but which is there, that these elements are a bit more centered and not sitting directly on those edges where we can't really use them. That would be very useful. And to achieve this, we can go back to the Start Game screen, because that is where we have this view with the input element and the buttons. And of course, we can now position this view, and we can change how it's positioned and laid out. And for this, you learned that we do that with help of the style sheet object that is exposed by React Native. Because this allows us to create a style sheet object, which allows us to set up styles that can then be attached to our different components and elements. So here I'll add a styles constant with stylesheet.create, like this. And now in here, the question is, which kind of styles do we want? And I want to start with a basic style for the main view that wraps these elements, which ensures that this view is a bit more away from the edges of the device. So I will name this style object input container. The name is up to you though. And I will add flex1. Flex1, as you learned before, ensures that the element on which we add this styling object takes up as much space as it can. So that could be the entire space on the screen, or if there is another sibling element somewhere, they would split the available space, depending on the flex options set on that sibling container. Here it will be the only container, and therefore it should take up the entire available space. Now in addition, I will also add some padding here, so that we have some distance to the edges, and I will add 16 pixels of padding, though you can of course play around with that to find the right amount for your requirements. I will also add some extra margin to the top, so some extra distance to the top outside of the box, though it won't matter too much right now because we have no background or border anyways, so we don't really see where the view box ends and starts, but still I'll use margin top here. And set a margin top of 100 pixels to push this view, to which I'll add my styling, away from the top edge of the device. And speaking of that, we can now add the style prop to this view that holds the text input and add styles.inputContainer to it, so that these styles are applied to this view. And if you do that and save everything, it should automatically refresh your applications here on your devices. And now the content is a bit further away from the device edges, which is nice. Of course, that's not all we want to do when it comes to layouting. It's just a first step. As a next step, it would be nice to have some background behind this entire input area, so behind the input element and the buttons, which separates the input area from the rest of the screen. At the moment, everything is white here. Later, we will add a background image, but either way, I want to visually separate the input area from the background of this screen. And therefore, what I'll do as a next step is I'll add a background color to this input container, which is the element that holds my input element and the primary button. And I'll add a background color, which I prepared in advance, which has a hex code of 27063C, which is this plum color here. If I save this, we got this background color here, and because of flex1, it's basically taking up the entire screen. We just have some white space up here because we have margin top 100, so the entire container does take up all the space it can, but it is pushed away from the top by 100 pixels, and that's this white area. But the rest now has this color. Now, this is actually not the look I want though. Instead, I just want to have a tiny box around the input and the buttons. I don't want to add a background to the entire screen. Now, this could be achieved by actually removing flex1. If we do that, it only takes up the space it needs to squeeze the elements, the content of this box into itself. So now it only takes up as much space as needed by the text input and the buttons and the padding added here. And for the moment, that's closer to what I want, even though we will fine-tune this again later. But for the moment, we have this input area here. As a second step, I will now also add a margin horizontal, so left and right, of 24 pixels, so that we also have some spacing to the left and right. And I want to add rounded corners to this input area. So therefore, I'll also add border radius and give this a border radius of, let's say, 8 pixels. So if we save this, we now have these nice rounded corners. In addition, I think it would be nice to have a little bit of a shadow behind this box. And that's also something we haven't done before. And adding shadows is different from what you know from web development. Because in web development, if you would add a shadow, you could do this by adding the box shadow CSS property. But this does not exist in React Native. Instead, if you want to add a shadow, there are two main ways which differ between Android and iOS. On Android, you can add an elevation property here to your styling, which does not exist in CSS, but which instead is React Native specific. And elevation takes a value like 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So we have different levels of elevation. And the higher the level, the more shadow will be added. If I add 4, for example, what you will see is that on the Android device, we now have a tiny shadow behind this box. It might be clearer if we pick a higher number like 8. If we set 8, now we can see it a bit more clearly that there is a shadow. Now I will go back to 4 though. So we have a little bit of a background shadow on Android now, but we have absolutely no shadow on iOS. And the reason for that is that elevation indeed is an Android-only property. It has no effect on iOS because you can't add shadows with elevation. It's an Android-specific concept. And here it's really important to keep in mind that all these views, all these core components which we're using are compiled to native components for the different platforms. And we have different native components for Android and iOS. And these native components support different style properties in their native languages. And the style properties we set here are in the end also translated to native style instructions by React Native. And many style properties can be translated into fitting instructions for both operating systems, iOS and Android. But the elevation property is an exception. It can be translated into an appropriate instruction on Android, but there is no equivalent to this elevation concept in iOS, and that's why we have no shadow there. If we want to add a shadow for iOS, we can do that, but we do it with a different set of properties, with the shadow properties: shadow color, shadow offset, shadow opacity, and shadow radius. These 4 properties together allow us to add a shadow on iOS, in addition to adding a shadow on Android with elevation. Now, shadow color allows you to pick the color of the shadow. You could create a reddish shadow, but here I'll use black as a shadow color. But of course, you can pick any color you want. Shadow offset then wants an object where you control how much the shadow should be offset from the original object to which it belongs to the left and to the right. Therefore, you have a width and a height property here, which you can set. And you set a number here, which will be treated as pixels by which the shadow will be offset. For example, if I choose 0 for the width and 2 for the height, the shadow will not be offset to the left or right, but it will be pushed down a little bit by 2 pixels. And you can play around with these values to find the shadow positioning you want. Now, what you also need to set is the shadow radius. This basically controls how much the shadow expands, so to say. And here I'll choose 6, because again, here you provide a value, which is a number, and you can play around with that value to see the impact of different numbers on the shadow that is created. Last but not least, you can add a shadow opacity, to control how transparent a shadow is. For example, here I'll set this to 0.25, but you can play around with this value as well to see how that influences the effect of a shadow and how strong a shadow is. Now with those settings here, if we save everything, we now have a nice little shadow behind the box on iOS as well, and we have the elevation related shadow on Android. Now if I would, for example, crank up the shadow opacity to 1, you would see that the shadow is much stronger on iOS now. So that's what I meant. You can play around with that to get a feeling for how this shadow works. Here I just want to have a little bit of a shadow, and therefore I'll set it up like this. And that's another major step. The app still doesn't work, the buttons don't work, the text input does nothing, but we learned something new about styling. We learned how to add shadows, and we gained more practice on how to set up styling on our own components combined with those core React Native components. And since this is something you will do all the time when building React Native apps, this is of course crucial to understand. And now you also know how you can add shadows.